Hello, everyone, and welcome to a bonus Women Plus Water conversation. And this is a little bit of a first post-COVID for us because we haven't had an in-person event. And so it's fantastic to have people here and to have all of our panelists in the same place at the same time. We're used to having people all over the world in different time zones. And I just want to welcome everybody who's online. It's fantastic to have you here. And it's also fantastic to have the people in the room. And I'm Corinne Schuster-Wallace. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. And I want to begin by acknowledging that all of us are participating today from traditional territories of First Peoples across Canada, but also around the world. And so those of us in Calgary here are gathering on Treaty 7 territory, where it's the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pilkani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. And this Women Plus Water conversation is actually brought to you from Calgary, for those of you here in Calgary, but the joint between the University of Calgary and the University of Saskatchewan, as well as the UNU Water Hub here at the University of Calgary. And collectively, we are committed to honoring and supporting Indigenous peoples, Indigenous languages, Indigenous cultures, and Indigenous values that belong to the land. But for those of you who know me and are regular people coming to the Women Plus Water conversations, you know that we can't just stop at the land. And the land is so intimately tied to the water, and that water is the lifeblood of societies, it's the lifeblood of economies and communities. And so really, when we're thinking about and paying respects to the ancestors of these places, we really need to think about and recognize the stewardship of both lands and waters. And I invite you who are joining us from other territories and other nation states to reflect on the First Peoples and the lands and waters of the places where you call home. I am excited to kick off this bonus Women Plus Water event. It's a herald to the exciting lineup that we'll have starting in January of 2025. And I'm not going to give you any teasers, but we will put a website link up so you can see the types of conversations that we'll be having in 2025 from January through till April or May. And today's conversation, it's a little bit different. We're not exploring a scientific or a disciplinary theme. What we're looking at today is around leadership diversity and women in water and, leadership diversity. It's absolutely critical right now. It's a component of innovation, and the economic and societal benefits of innovation and diversity have been well established. And I would argue that never have we needed that innovation and that diversity in the water space than now, because we think about the intense and frequent floods, the storms, the droughts, the wildfires. I know here in Calgary, there have been infrastructure challenges this summer as well. And we need to think about these changes in the timing, the types of precipitation, the threats to water quality. And our communities and our economic sectors, we're looking for innovative solutions. We're looking for inclusive and sustainable solutions. And I'd argue that that really only comes from diversity in teams and diversity in leadership. And so the solutions may not stand the test of future change. They may not benefit everybody equally. And so we need to be investing up in innovative technologies, training, and policies and programs, and also innovative and inclusive governance structures and systems. And so I'm excited because I'm going to put the panel on the spot. Before I do, a few housekeeping rules, particularly for those online. You are able to listen in French, and so click on the globe-shaped interpretation button in the bottom toolbar and choose French. We'll be approximately an hour in length, and we are recording this, and it will be up on the website. We also have live English transcription. So again, if you would like that, then you can turn that on in the Zoom. And so there's an English captions will be visible if you click on the CC on the toolbar. And in the last 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 15, we'll see, we'll open up to questions from the audience here in person, but also online, and we have someone who'll be monitoring that. I do ask those of you with questions in person if you can speak into a mic so that the people online can hear us. And so I'm going to start because it's wonderful. We have Kerry Black here. Dr. Kerry Black is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Calgary. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Integrated Knowledge, Engineering and Sustainable Communities. She received her PhD from the University of Guelph, and her research focused on sustainable water and wastewater management in Indigenous communities. And I also have the pleasure and privilege of being a UNESCO co-chair with Kerry and with others in a mountain water sustainability UNESCO chair that's hosted here at the University of Calgary. So welcome, Kerry. And Soula on the far end is Soula Chronopoulos, is an accomplished entrepreneur and professional. I learned that she's a neuroscientist. Yes. So I'm learning all kinds of things, and there are all sorts of wonderful people in water, and you never know what walks of life they've come from previously. But accomplished entrepreneur and professional who serves as the president of AquaAction, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to restoring freshwater health in North America. And with over 20 years of experience in executive leadership, digital transformation, and entrepreneurship, Soula brings a wealth of expertise to this role. She's implemented over 10,000 water tech solutions in the municipal sector across North America, and this has solidified her as a respected figure in the industry. And in recognition of her outstanding contributions, Soula was ranked as one of Canada's top 100 female entrepreneurs by Profit magazine in 2012. And I'm coming to the middle, last but certainly not least, Dr. Genevieve McCormack is a retired public servant with 35 years of experience in the science and technology with the federal government. And so throughout this period, she has exercised oversight on a wide range of programs associated with water, water quality, groundwater, water levels and flows, tides and currents, and charting. And so Dr. McCormack also chaired the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board of Control, which oversees the outflows of Lake Ontario into the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so I'm thrilled to have all three of you here. Thank you very much. And we've been talking and laughing about the water puns, and there'll be a few more thrown in to this conversation, I'm sure. And I'm going to start by breaking the ice. Frozen water, just in case you didn't get it, by starting with a quick reflection on a high point in your career in water leadership. And Genevieve, I introduced you last. I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Well, I wanted to share something that happened to me last May 2023. When I first became Director General of the Canadian Hydrographic Service in 2018, one of the roles that I had to play was to represent Canada at the International Hydrographic Organization, which is the organization that sets the standards for charts, but also for water levels and tides, etc. And at the time, I was only one of 4 or 5 women that headed hydrographic services around the world. So naturally, when I'd show up at meetings, it was mainly men that were there. And so Canada, through my department, Fisheries and Oceans, actually financed a project to empower women in hydrography. And we did a number of things, and the IHO Secretariat was very active in doing these. And at IHO Assembly, which took place in May 2023, where all the countries come together, the Secretariat had actually organized a series of events to highlight the project. And we also financed young women to come in and see how governance happened, and et cetera. So that I was quite proud of the work. But at the end of Assembly, as we were leaving, a senior member of the Chinese delegation came forward to talk to me. And Canada and China relations are not that great, and we actually hadn't spoken at all. But the one thing she wanted to talk to me was about this empowering women in hydrography. She said, "Thank you for the program." And I said, "Well, China has always done a lot to integrate women in the workplace." And she says, "No, we needed this program. Thank you." I thought that was a great way to end my career on a high note. That's it. So I'm going to stop there.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Soula next. I'm going to keep you hopping. It's you know.
Thank you very much for that, Corinne. My background is in corporate. So I did start as a neuroscientist. I launched a company. I worked in the United States, primarily in healthcare. And then I entered into the academic world and the digital transformation. So I did a lot of work for corporate organizations like the Bank of Canada, Canada Post. So if you get your mail, likely they did the training programs that we had developed. And I came into water by accident, I would say, in January of 2023, when the foundation that founded the charity AquaAction approached me. It's a wonderful foundation, the de Gaspé-Beaubien family, which is a family of entrepreneurs that brought the cell phone to Canada. So Rogers was started by them, and they're self-made entrepreneurs, and they had this wonderful charity that focused on water. I said, what the heck? What mean water? We have water. We don't need anything in water. But by nature, what they were doing is they were launching companies in the sector. And what happened over time is that we have technology companies, but technology and innovation was never necessarily accepted, I think, in the water sector as something that is truly environmental or truly climate related. And I think the high point, I would say, in my career since I've been in water is working with an incredible ecosystem of people passionate for water and protecting it, and having them accept technology and innovation as one of the solutions where we take action and we go into the economy, into industries, into agriculture, and we implement solutions that are going to protect our future. So for me, it was that acceptance was a major first step. And the second major, I think, accomplishment is that we have 65% of our entrepreneurs start off as they're women, basically women driven. And that by the time they reach the commercial stage, it drops a little bit to about 45%. But the fact that we're able to nurture that high percentage of female entrepreneurs in Canada is also a high point, I would say, for our organization.
Thank you very much, Kerry.
Well, I'm hoping I haven't gotten to the high point yet. Hope I didn't peak. But I think one of the moments, and there's a few different ones, depending on sort of how I look back, but I think I spent a lot of time, lost isn't the right word, but not seeing myself, I think, in what I was seeing around me, and not knowing whether or not there was a space for me and how I was seeing the world. And for me, one of the points where I felt like finally I had been seen was when I took a bit of a risk, and I never necessarily wanted to be in academics. I did, but I didn't see myself, like I said, and I was working at the University of British Columbia. I had just gotten my first academic position. And I met with the University of Calgary about a Canada Research Chair opportunity. And I said to myself, I'm not going to keep doing what I've always done, which was to try and find a way to communicate that what I do in water is engineering enough. Because at that point, I've been working with a lot of people. And the notion in engineering is that they're important, but they don't factor into your day-to-day life. And I really just couldn't resolve that for myself. And so I said, if I'm going to go to the University of Calgary, I'm going to lay it all out there. I'm going to say exactly what I do. I'm not going to try and engineering, word friendly it. I'm just going to say what I want to do. And I did. And it worked. Obviously I'm here. But it was a chance for me to finally be able to feel confident that what I'm doing is engineering and it's enough. And for me, as someone who always has struggled with imposter syndrome, that was a really big moment. And it gave me this space to be able to have the confidence to move forward in the water space without having to second guess myself. I mean, obviously, many of us still second guess ourselves, but it's a high point in feeling like I was able to say what I wanted to do, what I felt strongly about, and that someone was listening, and I didn't feel I had to sugarcoat it. And for me, that from a confidence perspective was a really important moment.
Thank you, Kerry. And that's a fantastic segue into our next series of questions, because it's wonderful to hear that there are highlights, there is growth, that we're seeing some of the opportunities being realized. But Women Plus Water and the Women Plus Water community really emerged from a single event back in 2018 when the first Gender Week of the federal government. And I'd been doing gendered water for multiple years. And I said, well, we should have an event around water. And little did I realize that initial conversation, it really showed the need. that we have for women and for equity deserving groups. You spoke about imposter syndrome and not feeling belonging and not necessarily talking the language that you talk and the values that you walk. And so I'd really like to hear from the three of you about the barriers that women and other equity deserving groups still face in leadership, in achieving leadership positions, and how these can be addressed. So we'll go to Soula and come back, and hopefully you're okay. Okay.
So I think we face two barriers as women. And as somebody who grew up in an IT world, I'm going to get a little bit, maybe slightly raunchy, but I've heard enough dongle jokes to last me a lifetime. And I remember when I first started my career, I felt like an imposter. I didn't belong there, and I was made to feel I didn't belong there. And I think at some point in my career, I realized there's two barriers to my success. The first one is, yes, the world. And that's when I started being assertive. So when I got asked questions once, and once I got asked the question, well, how did you make it here, when I was an executive in Atlanta? And I was alone with this person in a conference room, and he said to me, well, how did you get here? And I said, obviously, I schlepped my way to the top. I said something different. And then he said to me, oh my God, I didn't say that. You did. I said, that was the question behind your question. I said, you should never ask a woman that question, because you're assuming I don't have the skills to be here. And I can assure you, he became my best friend after that. And he never asked another woman that question. But I realized then and there that every time I feel that sense of I don't belong here because I'm a woman, I would address it head on. Because if we don't address these things head on, and we allow things to sit in the air when somebody's saying something, or a shot is taken, or a microaggression, I don't allow microaggressions. But the second one is internal. That was the second barrier I realized, and it was me. It was having fought my way through the corporate world and having, achieved a certain place. I find that we women hold each other to a different standard. And I learned at one point that we have to stop doing that to each other, because we are our toughest critics, and to each other, we're also tough, because we feel that if I've done it, you should do it too. You should fight your way through. But I think there's a lot more success when we feel we belong at the table, we take our place, and we act like we belong. We don't make ourselves small. We make ourselves big and loud and up there with every male voice around that table, and that we lift each other up. Because when we lift each other up, we're going to have a lot more success. I know it sounds cliche and sounds like Kamala Harris, but it's actually true. And that's why we have so many women, I think, in our ecosystem that are women in tech. And so those two barriers, we got to overcome them and forget about our gender and feel like we belong, and address anything that comes our way like we would if this was our child saying it to us. My kid said something like this to me, I'd say, well, why'd you say that? So head on addressing, I think, is important.
And Genevieve, you've already told us sort of what it feels like being one of 5 women in a international community of men. So perhaps if you can let us know what you think of some of the barriers.
So I'm going to actually, we went and checked what some of the barriers were. So Canadian Hydrographic Service has about 300 employees, men and women, but there were very, very few women in leadership positions when I started. So, and we ran competitions, and there were no more women in the leadership positions. Why? Because either they weren't applying or for the positions, or they were not, they were missing some of the qualifications. And so the men were getting the position. Not that I have there's nothing wrong with the men. They were very qualified. So I asked one of the few women leaders in the organization to set up a women's network and ask them what was going on. And she and I were not sure what we were going to get. And we got lots of feedback, because we created a safe space for women at all stages of their career to come forward. In fact, we ended up with 6 themes. That's how many things they told us. So things like, we don't want to apply for leadership positions because the culture is not welcoming. We don't get heard when we go into meetings because it's always the same people who are talking. So there was a number of things that came out, but
what it made me realize is that we need to support women throughout their career, so that if when you start out, you stay, because we were losing some women, but also if they feel prepared, they will apply for those leadership positions. And I can say that today, half of the leadership at the Canadian Hydrographic Service, I mean, there's gender balance now. We've got many more women. And that's how we found out what some of the barriers were, was we asked what they were.
Thank you. Kerry.
Yeah, I think so many barriers, and yet so many opportunities, but it's hard to see them when you are in the barriers, I'll say. I think, so to pick up something that you said, Soula, there, the internal piece is, I would say, hands down, no one is harsher on me than I am. And that's a great quality in some respects, because it pushes you, it fuels you to move forward, but it's also horrific to live with on a day-to-day basis at times. And so I think part of that internal conversation that we have with ourselves is really negative. But a lot of that's fueled by what's happening around us. And we carry a lot of roles and jobs. And, you know, prior to having children, I had a different set. It's not more or less, it's a different set of challenges. And then I had children, and it's a different set of challenges. And it's a constant feeling of not doing enough, not being there enough, not being around enough, not having enough flexibility, wanting to apologize for doing something, wanting to apologize for not doing something. It's just a constant rhetoric, and it's a very hard to unpack that. And for some of us, it's looks and feels different. And for some of us, it's harder, I think, to separate. Certainly, I think I've gotten strength over the years from really crappy situations. And I would have said, oh, you know, you'd rather they didn't happen. You know, my very first job, I worked for someone who hated me, and he hated me because there was a lot of things going on in his life. But he kept telling everybody that I didn't dress appropriately for an engineering job. It's because I wore a suit, but I wore high heels, and that's not what a field engineer does. It's not what a field engineer does. It doesn't matter if my trunk was full of stuff to go out and work in the field. It was that in the office, I didn't look the way that he wanted me to look. And he made lots of comments in front of me and behind my back. And I just said, enough, I'm going to another job. And then my second job, I worked with someone who was very friendly. He liked me a lot. And then I saw the other side of it, and I went, I don't like this side either. So I left engineering. And that, to me, that's where we lose people, is you have these experiences, you go, this isn't worth it, I'm out of here. And so we're not catching people at those moments and finding a way to keep them engaged, because it's too late. We catch people when it's too late and they've gone on to different professions. And luckily I had mentors who brought me back slowly. And a lot of the great mentorship I had was from men. Throughout my career, people who saw me for the first time. It was in my master's. I distinctly remember the day and the conversation where he made me feel like I was intelligent and I knew what I was doing. And it was like, oh, okay, I didn't realize I needed that external validation. But actually, I think it's okay to say we do. We do need people to recognize who we are and what we do. And that's an important part of that internal dialogue. So the internal barriers and the external piece all coming together. And then also at some point being able to say, like, screw it. Really, I think there's power in being able to say, I don't need to pretend to be something that I'm not. I'm just going to be me. And sometimes you have to play the game. Sometimes you can't, fight every battle. You can find creative ways to fight that battle. But I think the barriers for us is just a whole lot of expectation built on the backs of one individual person. And it can feel so overwhelming at times that you just say, forget it. And that's where I think these networks of women supporting each other is key, because you start to feel pretty isolated, I think, in that process.
And just you telling that story reminds me of an online meeting that I had, and I got really emotional. And I realized how awful my current situation, not current, the current situation was at the time, was that all this person had done was not question me and had accepted what I was saying as coming from an expert. And I hadn't realized that I was constantly day to day fighting to prove myself, to recognize that, you know, I know what I'm saying and that I have the experience to be able to be at this table. And that was one of my mind shift moments as well, is sort of, okay, what am I doing then? And why am I here? If somebody actually having that basic decency and respect is making me feel overwhelmed and really is an anomaly in my day-to-day life. So I thank you for that. And I think it's important to remember that there are systemic barriers, absolutely. And that's why, yes, we're women up here, but the Women Plus Water has had all kinds of people from different walks of life. And there are a lot of men who are really supportive and allies for equity deserving groups. And actually, I'd hoped to have Al Pietranero up here because he's done so much for women in water technicians and created a special call for women in water, recognizing the barriers in water technician, field technicians in Canada. And so from equipment not fitting, I mean, there are these practical elements as well too. Well, are you sure you're strong enough to lift the equipment? Well, I can lift a whatever pound baby on my hip and carry them around for hours. So yes, I think I can do that. And there are ways of us figuring out, okay, well, how do we get equipment from A to B? Because not everybody can carry heavy equipment and there've got to be other ways of doing it. So I think that having the conversations, bringing some of these barriers out, that's the way to start affecting change and creating change from within. So thank you all for that. And Soula, I'm not going to start with you, but you actually started us on the next question, which was, what are the tools in your toolbox? And clearly you have one around answer the question with the why question. You know, why are you even asking me that question and putting people on the spot and definitely interrupting bias? So, but I'm going to start, I think, with Genevieve in terms of what are some of the tools that you go to on a regular basis and used as a woman in water leadership?
I think the first piece is to be authentic, be yourself. And women sometimes have a leadership style that is a bit different, and that's okay. And the other piece, I think the other tool that's important is networking, having people in two ways, having people that can be allies, and that's gender neutral, like allies in what you're trying to achieve, but also having a really good support person or a couple of support people that you can actually talk to in confidence. They don't necessarily have to be in your water world. They can be, my spouse is my main support person, but I have a couple of friends as well, and it allows you to test ideas and to reinforce your authenticity. Now, the other thing that I would say, the network, and you've mentioned that, is really important, in particular at the beginning of your career. I worry about early career folks who could leave the profession because very often you feel alone when there's a bad situation and you haven't built up your network yet. And so I think building that network, having a place to go is really important. Stop there.
Kerry, I'm going to keep you on your toes.
Didn't know where you were going there. The toolbox it evolves. There's an element, and it might be more controversial, but there's an element of growing some thick skin. And it's not to say that you let things go. It's just that you have to start to realize that people say things, and it's not about you. It's probably more about them. And you need to find a way to not internalize it. So the thick skin is about not internalizing things that you think people are saying, and just take people where they're at in that moment. And that's a really hard one. I wish I'm saying like it's a tool that I use. It's a tool that I'm developing, I'll say. For me, humor has been the tool of choice for me. It has gotten me out of awkward situations. It's gotten me into important conversations. It's been a way of brushing off my own imposter syndrome at times. It's been a way of making people feel comfortable from all walks of life. There's an element of humor in my toolbox that I think is key. And I think it comes down to the authenticity for sure, is that you just sort of crack that nut of getting people out of their discomfort for that minute, whatever they're thinking. You lose it when you throw in that element of humor. For me, that's been critical. And I think that's really been helpful to shape different ways of approaching a conversation for sure. The other tool I would say is a recognition of who you are, like a deep self-awareness. And that has come for me over time. It's paralleled with confidence. I wouldn't say the self-awareness always had the confidence side with it. But there's a reality to who you are as an individual. So I could say, I really love the sun is shining today. And I can guarantee you that most people in my life will think I'm being sarcastic. There's an element of my nature that lends itself to that sort of response. There's an element to my assertiveness that comes off as too strong to some people. There's part of that I can control. There's part of that I can work on. And there's part of that is there and I don't want to necessarily work on it. And there's a self-awareness built into that of knowing when it's appropriate and when it's not. It's also recognizing that you can't apologize for who you are, but you can be respectful of the situation that you're in. So the tool I try to use is a little bit of that understanding of who I am and who everyone else is in the room. And I think part of that comes down to understanding different people's perspectives is the other toolbox in there.
Thank you. Soula. I agree with you, Kerry. I often use humor, but it's more about me than it is about anybody. But I'd say there's two tools I use often. The first one is I saw this show years ago. It was called Lie to Me. And it was about a detective who could read the room and read body language. And I remember I devoured that whole thing because I thought it was just fascinating how he could pick off and read that room so well that he knew when somebody was guilty or not. So I started studying body language and I could read a room. I could read when somebody's interested in what I'm saying, when they're not. I know when I've closed a deal and when I haven't. And I found that managing employees, managing my surroundings, it helped me manage my surroundings because if I could adjust my words to what I'm saying. So I tell a lot more stories because I feel people want to hear that. But it's also, I read the room and I know exactly if I'm looking at somebody and saying something, whether it's hitting or not, and I adjust what I'm saying to them. That was a powerful thing for me to recognize and to kind of refine over time. So don't all be scared. I'm not reading you right now. But I'd say the second thing is I recognize that I cannot always say yes. And there's a lot of power in saying, I don't know. And this is not something that I'm willing to get behind. Because as women, we also tend to want to be pleasing and telling everybody, we know this. Yes, absolutely, we can do it. But there's a weakness in saying yes to everything. So learning to say no and why I'm saying no, I think was also a powerful tool that I've learned about throughout my career.
Thank you. They've certainly been helpful to me.
I'm reading.
You're reading me? I know I'm thinking, oh, what have I said and how have I acted for the last hour and a half that we've been hanging out together? Yeah, don't ever tell people that you're reading the room, but definitely read the room. And the confidence piece for me, that's the one. And people look at me and where I am and I sort of say, yeah, I get nervous every time and you channel it and you know, yeah, you're nodding, right? And it's part of it's that imposter syndrome. Part of it's just having the confidence, as you said, Soula, to be who you are and be somewhat unapologetic for it. And it's definitely learned skills. And I think that mentorship piece is really important from that perspective. And leading on from that, and again, Genevieve, you talked about that international workshop and the women's network and creating a safe space. So you've already started seeding a little bit of the answers to my next question, which is how organizations can create a culture that supports and retains members of equity deserving groups. How do we engage in and harness the diversity and create these spaces for people so that they're not leaving engineering and that we're actually getting the value of the diverse perspectives as well as those individual values and strengths? So what can institutions and organizations be doing differently?
And one of the things that the Women's Network asked us to do at the Canadian Hydrographic Service is actually do a culture audit. I had no idea what that was. So we brought in an independent consultant and she came in with a questionnaire and people really I was really pleased that people got engaged, and there's a pretty long questionnaire about what their values were, what they would like to see the organizational values move towards, and have some concrete things to work on. I think the most difficult thing to work on is changing behavior. And one of the things that we then organized was bystander training to arm people who would witness inappropriate behaviors or, comments that might be not nice about people, and that were just part of the culture, but where we're trying to change. So everybody has a role to play in culture, but what the organization can do is signal that it's willing to change and then get some help. And in fact, because we did that, we actually had a couple of women come forward and actually file complaints because they felt that the organization was going to listen. So there are things that we can do. You have to be looking at the long term because it's hard to change a culture, but it's doable. And I think we should try.
I'm going to come to you next because, as you said, you're sort of not reflecting on a career. You're still affecting change in many ways. And I know it's not up to people of equity deserving groups to do that, but we do create some of that space. So I don't know if this is what can be done or what are you planning?
So I think, for one, I think the barriers that I faced as a privileged North American, non-Indigenous white woman, and then I go, well, those are first world problems, literally. And I have to remind myself regularly, constantly, daily, that what I am struggling through are privileges at the same time. That's really important for me just to say. The one thing I want to say, though, is that, so if I go back to the situation of my first job, and the second job that were both horrific, and I think about what occurred in those situations, I think if I liked what I was doing, if I saw value in what I was doing, if I saw myself in what I was doing, I would have fought. I didn't like what I was doing, didn't see myself in it, couldn't make the connection. And that to me is the area of interest, because we lose so many people in the way that we've defined what is or is not a certain profession or a certain way of enacting change, that if I don't see myself, I'm out of there. I'm gone. And so I think we've lost people before we've even recruited them to a lot of these professions, because there's a notion of what it is and what it's meant to be. And I think the sooner that institutions and organizations can break down those expectations, those silos, those barriers, that you don't have to be one thing, the more will attract people to it. The one thing that got me back into engineering was a mentor who said to me at the time, sure, I said, I want to go help people, and I don't see myself doing that in engineering, which I think is a very telling statement about how engineering professes to the world. I was like, I want to help people. I can't do that in engineering. Those two things are actually intrinsically linked, but I didn't see it. And so she said to me, well, fine, you want to go be a doctor, because that's what I wanted to be. Every year, I always think I'm going to go to med school this year. And she said, but you'll only ever solve problems once they've already happened. You become an engineer and you can start to solve the problems before they occur. And it was such a light bulb moment that I thought, well, why the heck aren't we telling everybody this? We'd attract way more people if we were able to showcase how we can actually benefit the world. And you see across, it's not just a North American trend, it's an international trend. When you have programs that can bring that linkage closer of helping, and I don't want to make gendered statements, but that caretaking, that notion of making a difference, you see higher levels of women engaged in those spaces. And so we need to start making that connection in all of these other spaces where we don't see that same level of diversity, because, once you get into it, you might face barriers, and we can talk about how to address those challenges for sure. But we have so many issues in being able to attract them to the profession in the first place that has to stop. That has to change. I got to be able to see myself in what people are saying. When I went into engineering, I'll tell you a story. When I went into engineering, I went to the university fair and I was like, I had good marks and I want to know what your best program is. I don't know why I did this. And I went to one university in Ontario, and he said his best program was engineering physics. Now, I could care less about engineering physics, okay? But I said, okay, well, what do you need to get in? And he wouldn't tell me what the marks were. You needed to get into the program. So I went into engineering because that guy pissed me off. And so that was my motivation. which has worked out well. That does still motivates me, but it just goes to show we sometimes don't know why we're doing things. And we need to start making those connections as to why we're doing it. Because I think that's where we're missing a whole bunch of opportunities, is even knowing what engineering is, or knowing what working within the water space is and what it could be, all the different ways that we can work together. It doesn't have to be in the conventional. It can be outside. It can be in the periphery. It can be in the spaces in between. That's kind of where I see that going.
Thank you. And you remind me of colleagues who have pointed out language matters and communication matters. And so even how we're describing job postings, and if we keep it as that technical kind of, and actually Dr. Andrea Rose in the back, so it's her that I'm paraphrasing here. But even if you talk about the technicalities and that you'll be able to use science and learn more about science versus making a difference, then you attract different people. And so, who are the people that you want to attract to the position that you've got open? And then use the language that's appropriate, that's going to meet the values and the needs and the desires that they have for opportunities for employment. Soula, I'm going to hand over to you on that note.
Back in 2016, when I worked for the academic network that was global, there was 26 campuses. One of the teams I had was in Morocco. And I was tasked with building a team to do a lot of UN work, because the UN didn't necessarily pay a lot of money, but it was lucrative work. And we needed to find a way to produce that at lower cost. So one of our teams in Morocco was going to be doing that. And I decided, we have our own biases when we hire people. And I decided to do an experiment with the management team in Morocco. I said, we're going to select based on skills. So we're going to select the CVs based on skills, and then we're going to allow them to do the tests to see, can they do the work before we even know if they're male or female. And of course, at the time, I didn't necessarily know some of the names, to be quite frank with you, whether they were male or female, to be honest. But we did that process. And then in the third iteration, we interviewed them live. And it turns out that the highest qualified skilled workers, 50% were women. And this is a very male-dominated society. So when I brought the women in and we hired them, there was a little bit of consternation from the male management. They didn't know how to handle this, because they had to come in and wear their coverage and all that. And it took a good year for them to respect the women. And in fact, many of them became managers, and some of them even went to other parts of the world. But I say that story because when we look at things from a skill base and we take away our own biases, we'll find that it's a more equitable, society that we can build. And I think that we all come with inherent biases, and it matters who's in leadership. And I don't think it's natural for corporations to think like that. I think it's still a male-dominated world in many ways. But I also think the hope is that the generation we work with, I work with a lot of young engineers in universities, and I see the pressure they put on corporations to be equitable, to be sustainable, because they don't necessarily, money doesn't drive this newer generation. It is being proud of the work that they do. So I feel that we have a pressure that's coming from within, and there's an outgoing generation that's going to change because it has to. They all have to retire, including me. But I feel that the change is in the air, and we're at the cusp of a revolution for this sort of thing, because we're raising our children right. And we're raising the engineers and the scientists and everything we graduate right.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I realized that in my sort of calls notes, I didn't suggest to online participants that if you have a question, please put it in the question box, and we're monitoring that. And for those of you here in person as well, I've got one more panel question, and then it'll be over to you. So again, if you're online, please put your questions in the box, not in the chat. We're not monitoring the chat. There's a panel question and answer. So please put your questions there. And also, audience, these people have been in the spotlight for 45 minutes near enough now, so it'll be over to you. All right, so I am going to wrap up you talked about us being our harshest critics, and Soula, you talked about women being the harshest critics, perhaps, of other women. So my last question to the panel is around examples where no matter what level of our career, how can we support other women, equity deserving groups on their paths to leadership roles? What can we do? And maybe challenge yourselves. And I know that some of you have already been walking that walk, but what can we do, and what can other people do to promote that equity and that diversity in leadership? Oh, Soula, why don't you? I was going to say, that was my bone. You could sort of, whoever wanted to start first, but yes, we'll go to Soula first, and then Genevieve, and we'll end with Kerry.
With a joke too.
No problem.
I have 2 boys and I have a girl, and I think that sometimes when we go all in on the feminism part, we also I think hurt men in some ways and prevent them from doing what they can do. So I think the way we do it is that we stop thinking about it as women and we start thinking about it as the person themselves, the skills that they have, the competencies they have, and we take away the gender. Because today you're not just man and woman. There's other genders, or there's binary, there's all kinds of things. So we have to stop thinking about people in terms of gender and look at people in terms of competencies and skills. And I think that comes with better leaders. I think it's also the leaders who are going to create that space to make it happen. So I just feel that we lift each other up by lifting everybody up and assume that everybody's going into something with good intentions, and gender should have nothing to do with it, if that makes sense. I know this is a women in leadership thing, but I do believe that we need to do away with that, because then we put each other into a box.
2 comments. One of them will build on what you said, Soula, which is when we looked at the Women's Network's recommendations in the Canadian Hydrographic Service, I would say 80% of them actually improved things for everybody in the organization. And in fact, everybody was invited to participate in taking action. So I agree, what you ideally want is a gender neutral workplace where everybody feels welcome. The other comment I would make is when I was a graduate student, I lived with my aunt. And she said, you know, Genevieve, men, they apply for the jobs. They just go ahead and apply. And women, we wait until we feel fully competent before we put our name forward. We want to have ticked all the boxes and feel comfortable. And I get emotional when I think about this, because I always thought about her when I'd apply for jobs, because it's about taking a risk. And I did apply for jobs where I said, I'm not sure I'm comfortable. This is the imposter syndrome. I really don't know why I would be the right person. And, you know, sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't, but you take the risk. And so I think it's important to take a risk. And that's what I tell young people.
Yeah. So, and I had a really great train of thought that Genevieve just stole, because now I'm on a different train of thought. So I'm going to try and bring it back together. I think there's a notion that bringing more women to the table is enough for diversity, and it's super important, but diversity of perspective is, to me, what's more important at times. I think you need diversity at all the different levels, I'll say. So you can't just have an equal balance of men and women. That's one small aspect of the larger diversity piece. I've been in rooms full with women and still felt like the only person in the room that was understanding me. And I think part of that is the diversity of perspective. So I got to bring all these people to the table with different understandings and perspectives and ways of knowing and ways of living. And I've got to bring them all together and create space for everybody. And that, to me, is really important in the conversation, because it's not just about specific groups. It's not just about making a space that's safe. It's about ensuring that we have different voices at the table, and whatever that looks like, I think is important. The other piece for me that's been really important is, someone told me once, think of the most confident person you've ever met, male or female. For me, it was a bunch of dudes, I'll just be honest. But think of them. And then anytime you go into something, approach it with just 10% of the confidence of that person. And it sounds so silly, and I'm sure people have heard it before, but it actually is very effective. It's a way of overcoming some of that imposter syndrome piece, but that confidence in what you're saying and doing is critical. It's what stops us from taking chances. It's what stops us from negotiating better salaries. It's what stops us from thinking that we can do something, and just adding on that extra bit of confidence, no matter whether you have it or not, but just trying to have it, was a really great, I think, lesson learned for me over the last 15 years in particular.
Thank you. And to bring it back around to water a little bit, because we really haven't mentioned water, at least in the last 15 minutes or so. But Soula, you talked about water being an existential crisis, existential threat, and we all need water. I said it in my opening remarks. And so in some ways, that's the piece where we need that diversity. As I say, it matters, and water is gendered, and we have other equity deserving groups. We have Indigenous populations that don't have the same access to water in high income countries as other non-Indigenous people. And then we have people in low and middle income countries who are, unequally or disproportionately affected by water issues, and floods, droughts, wildfires. They don't affect all parts of a population, all regions at the same time. And even if you experience the same, then just socioeconomic status, internal resilience, all of that changes the way that you experience these water-related threats. And so if we can't come together, if there isn't a shared common value around water, then I don't know what there is, but I really appreciate all of your insights. I'm going to check in online and see. So it sounds as though there are some questions from online. I'm going to take one from online, and then if there's anything from the room as well, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone around, and I'm just going to do the mic share.
Right. So we have one question online, and that question is, what advice do you have for newcomers to the water world who are trying to find a mentor to help them feel comfortable in the industry and begin their career?
I'd say mentorship is so important. Obviously, it's been a huge part of my life. That being said, being in a different stage of my career, I now realize just how taxing and potentially, I don't want to say burden, but how much work it was for those mentors to be in my life. And so you get a lot of requests for mentorship, and it's really hard, I think, as a woman in a professional space, to find the balance, and you can barely feel like you have time for yourself. I think making a connection, for me, in-person connections are key. And I think there's an element of reaching out and seeking mentorship virtually through an email. That seems like an easy way of doing it, whether it's LinkedIn. I think if you can find a mentor near where you are, that's a great place to start, because it's very hard to make that connection virtually. The other piece that I found, I would say, I won't say more helpful than mentorship, but I would look to people that I wanted to be my mentors, and I would just see how they got to where they were. I'd listen into some of their conversations. With LinkedIn, you can see, okay, well, what did they do when they were, younger? Where did they start working? I remember, and Corinne does not remember this, but I distinctly remember a meeting at McMaster University. I was very young, and it was put on by UNU Inway, and Corinne was speaking, and I immediately said, I want to do what she's doing. And so I've got to stalk her a little bit and see and that was ages. I don't want to say how many years ago that was. It was a lot. There's decades in there. And so it's a lot. And so I think part of it is recognizing that there's an element of quiet mentorship that you can get by looking at people around you. And instead of saying, oh, I'll never be able to do that, or saying, oh, how did you get there, without, with that tone of maybe negativity, it's saying, look at these awesome people that I'm speaking to or listening to or learning from. And can I go and figure out how they got there and see? To me, there's so much that can be learned by creeping people on LinkedIn. And I say that not in a creepy way, in a, you'll see that people are in positions that you would not have expected. They are not linear trajectories. And I found that to be so, so powerful as a mentorship tool, was seeing you don't have to go A to B, B to C, C to D, D to E. You can go A to Z to J to K. You can go all over the place and still land in these really cool and unexpected places. Because what I found from that was they seemed to have all these doors open because they were open to different opportunities. And that to me was super powerful in that mentorship space. So recognize that people are taxed, that the silent work that we carry as women and as people in equity deserving groups is massive, that we can't always be the mentors that we want to be, but it doesn't mean you can't find inspiration and mentorship from people in different ways.
One way to approach it is to consider, a mentor can be a mentor for a short period of time, and you can have several mentors. And so I think one thing that can be useful when you're seeking a mentor is knowing what exactly are you interested in getting from that mentor. Are there specific topics, or is there something very specific? And when you contact them, they might say no. But if you are very clear about why you're interested in having them as a mentor, and if they're not available, would they have somebody to recommend? And then managing the relationship so that maybe it is 6 months or 4 months, or maybe it will be 2 years. But that constraining it to something that you're interested in might help start that relationship.
I can answer it in a different way, maybe. Because we are the only NGO or charity in Canada focused on freshwater, we get a lot of requests for connections. So if anybody's interested, our next Aqua Hacking Challenge, I will plug it, is coming up in the prairies, actually, and we'll be launching it in March. So for those that are interested in doing something, solving a problem in the region, and you want to get involved, you'll be automatically attached to mentors who are going to help you through to launch a company. And there's obviously seed funding at the end. But for those who just want to get connected to the industry, because we have over 95 active water tech companies across North America, we can help connect you. So not just to companies, but a huge, rich ecosystem that includes wonderful people at this table, WWF, the IJC, NOAA, etc. So I would encourage anybody who maybe has a question too, to reach out. And if we can connect you, we will. So info@aquaaction.org, and get involved, into the aqua mafia is what I call it, in a friendly way. I'm not the Don.
And hopefully a little more inclusive too. Sorry about that. So are there any other questions? Any questions from the room? I'd actually like to follow up, Soula, because the Women Plus Water, there is a question. I'm going to pass the mic now, but the Women Plus Water community, really, it started organically, and then we ended up talking about an expert list, and the next phase is virtual mentorship circles. And so taking what you're saying about in-person connections, but also sometimes just bringing people together around a water theme to have those conversations. And we'll be doing that through the expert list. So watch this space for this year. We're almost ready to launch it, but please go ahead.
Thanks. First of all, thank you all for your insight. And second, normally I feel like it takes me a few minutes to compose my thoughts and come up with something concise and clear, but we've all been about take the risk and ask. So I'll try and pull it together. When I think about sort of the leadership component, I think of like a strong base and kind of like the building blocks. And I feel like a lot of the things that came up, like the self-talk, taking risks, thick skin, resilience, skills and tools in your toolbox, start young, like some of those. And I come actually from, speaking of Kerry, a roundabout way I have a bit of a side trail in sport. And whenever we talk about recruitment and participation, like we look younger and younger and younger, because that's when those skills kind of get shaped and formed. So I guess I'm just curious your thoughts on whether enough is being done at like a childhood level to enact change there. And if not, like what our role can be. Like, again, when we talk about mentorship, that's already an added piece. So to get involved in schools or something at the youth level is like another piece to add. So I don't want to like propose that we all have to do that as well, but ways to kind of work on hitting younger and younger generations and having that build up over time.
You want to go? Go ahead.
So I think we're getting better at it. I think there's a recognition, though, that if you haven't instilled some of that in grades 6 to 8, you've lost them. And that's in a North American context specifically, is because, entry into a lot of the programs where we're doing this work requires you to take certain classes in your high school years. And you can shut the door on that pretty quickly. So there's elements that are getting better there, where we also have to recognize is we have to go younger and younger, but we also have to find different pathways of entry into the spaces. And we're starting to see a little bit of better job of that, because there's certainly, as we speak internationally and locally for Indigenous peoples, there's a recognition that there's been harm done to the educational system, and we've closed so many doors intentionally and not intentionally, but often intentionally, that we have to start making pathways for people to enter into the space, to be able to be in the same places and spaces that we are. So make it, start younger, get people motivated and engaged about what it is. Also think of the ways that we're communicating about it. Then have different pathways for people to enter into this space. And then it's a question of, so we've opened up all of these doors. What are we doing to ensure that people stay there? So there's all these different aspects. And I think the way that we communicate about it is key. And we still, I think, are siloed. I really do think we're still siloed. I think, certainly what I do is considered by the vast majority of my colleagues as not engineering. I think if I was talking to someone in grade 4 or 5 about what water treatment is, I would talk about it in very different ways than I think it had ever been taught to me. To get people interested and engaged and motivated, you don't throw out, words around different kinds of water treatment processes. You don't throw out quantum. You don't throw out these big words that people don't understand. You make it relevant. And I think that's where people get excited, is when they see relevance. And so if we're going to go younger and younger, we've got to find ways to engage them. But certainly we have to do a better job at what we're communicating and where, because we know we lose people at those early stages. So you see these big incentives for K to 12. We're getting closer to the K on that, because we realize that as children, as we evolve, we start to decide. I can see it in my own kids, where you start to figure out, oh, I'm just not good at that. As soon as you can lose that confidence as a kiddo, man, you've lost them, and it takes so many years to rebuild it. So I think that communicating to young people is about getting them excited about what it is that we're doing. And that looks and feels very different for certain kiddos. It looks very different in North America than it does outside of North America. But I think getting people engaged and excited about something is the best way to keep those doors open for people, and remind them that there's always a way back. There's always a way back into what you want to do. So you can work 30 years in something and at the end of it go, you know what? I really want to do this instead, and do it. There's always a way back to what it is that fuels and passions you. And if there's anything that I've seen in the classroom, is that students are most engaged on the pieces that they are passionate about. Once you figure out what that passion is, it's hard to control them. And so let's find ways to ignite passion on different topics.
I teach a course, I lecture a course at McGill University, third year business students in entrepreneurship, sustainability, and retail. And they all walk in not understanding there's a water crisis, but the minute they understand the water crisis, they get mad. And the first question they ask me is like, why isn't the government doing anything? And my answer is that they're getting there, but I think it starts with us. And what happens in the course of that program is that they end up coming up with a business plan to launch a business at the end. That's their final exam. And some of them actually go into it and do it. And I think the government is doing some good. And there's something called the Environmental Damages Fund, where a lot of major corporations are paying fines. And so what the government has done is turn around the ECCC, that's the Environmental Ministry, and they've turned around and turned that into funding for organizations across Canada who work in water and climate change, et cetera, to create literacy for this. And that includes from K to 12 and beyond. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of these awareness programs coming into the K-6 and the K-12 and beyond, because the government is now starting to funnel those damages or those fines into good. So I think we're going to see that very shortly. And a lot of these projects I know are getting underway right now. So hopefully in the next few years, which will include understanding the Indigenous experiences, understanding everything, and helping create stewards from a young age. I think that is where the future lies for us as a group. And you're absolutely right about that.
Thank you. And you actually reminded me this week, I got a phone call from our middle daughter, and she was so excited because she signed up for a volunteer program where she will actually go out as a university student into schools and talk about science with students in schools. So it's not just about us up here, right? It's about engaging undergraduate students as ambassadors for these lower levels. And I always start my kindergarten programs with hands up if you've got a tap in your house, and you can imagine the reaction to that. So you're absolutely right. It's about meeting people where they are. Well, talking of, we've had a fantastic panel. Thank you, Soula, Genevieve, Kerry. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the audience, both here and online. And as a reminder, we'll have the January events coming up. And so feel free to go to womenpluswater.org to see what our lineup will be for 2025. It'll be more amazing individuals talking about water in some way, shape, or form. And you're always welcome to either join the Women Plus Water expert list. And if you're not someone from an equity deserving group or with lived experience or someone who's supporting equity, diversity and inclusion in water, then use the list. You don't have to necessarily join the list, but the whole point is that there's no excuse now. We have such a depth of expertise across all walks of water, and you can find somebody who will support you with your panels, with your boards, with anything else that you may want and need around water. I want to thank everyone behind the scenes. AV, thank you very, very much. Back in Calgary, we have in Calgary, we have B and Tracy, but back in Saskatoon, we have Jesse and Stacy and Tara and Viviana and many others who've sort of making the Women Plus Water such a success. And so thank all of you today also for joining us for this conversation. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you, I hate to say 2025, but it's peeking around the corner. So all the best, and thank you very much to those online participants, and we'll be continuing here in person. Thank you, and have a good day, good evening, good morning.